Prof, thanks so much for your time. So just help us understand better, what do you mean about this divide between the geography of the ANC support and the economic hub of South Africa going unnoticed?
Thank you very much. Yes, what we've seen over the last decade or so is rising ANC membership in peripheral parts of South Africa, particularly poorer rural regions, and a declining support base within the major economic centers, the big cities of the country. So the mismatch is basically growing between where the power within the ANC lies and where the economy of the country exists. And this is a concern, I think, for various reasons.
And then what does this mean? Does this mean that in the rural areas where the ANC is growing in support, people there feel like the ANC has actually improved their lives and that's why they're giving them the support?
Yes, it reflects partly a greater dependence on state resources within impoverished rural areas. The state performs a much bigger part of the lives of people in places like Mpumalanga, the Northwest, the Eastern Cape, KZN. The state is a bigger part of their lives. It's a source of employment. It's a source of social grants. It provides people with free basic services, electricity and sanitation, and therefore it figures much more strongly in their lives. And perhaps naturally, people are more inclined to support the ANC and join the ANC because it has delivered to a greater extent than in the cities.
I mean,
but this is a challenge in the cities because this is where the resources are generated. This is where the economy is located.
Yes, that's correct. The cities is where the resources are generated. The economy is most active. Sorry to have interjected you there, but continue, please.
Yes, this is where resources are generated. This is where private sector is located. This is where the business sector is predominantly concentrated, and therefore this is critical. The resources that the state provides to rural areas have to be produced somewhere, and they come from the cities. And so we see a divide between, putting it simply, between politics and economics, which means that the political agenda is shaped much more by the distribution of resources and less by concerns about how we generate additional resources. And I think this is critically important. Government has to understand how we generate resources as well as how we spend them. And this is, I think it seems to be part of the causes, some of the underlying problems of our country at the moment. We've got this big misalignment between economic interests and political interests.
So, Prof, essentially what you're saying is that the ANC needs to pay more attention to the economic hub, because it is this economic hub that is enabling it to continue to provide the support for the urban areas and enabling its power, essentially, in government.
That's absolutely correct. This is where the source of the resources, this is where investment originates. And therefore, this is something that has to be thought taken very seriously. What is it that will generate investment, jobs, and tax revenues that can be used to spend in other parts of the country? And I think not enough consideration is given to that issue. I think we see a radical rhetoric that we must squeeze the economic engine harder to generate more resources without sufficient consideration as to what makes the golden goose lay its eggs. You know, what drives that resource generation process? What is it about business that is essential to create additional tax revenues and jobs and so on, that government has to work with business around that agenda and not simply see business as kind of the enemy, as something that needs to be squeezed in order to pay for public services?
For sure. So the candidate who wins on Sunday will definitely have to take this on board. But let's talk about that Sunday result. So we've got most of the votes from the various provinces in. I'm not too sure if the Free State has come out, but we do know that it's leading towards the side of Nkosazana Dlamini Zuma. On Sunday, I mean, who do you see ultimately taking the crown?
I think it's very, very hard to say because of the fact that individual delegates are free to choose ultimately where they cast their vote, who they cast their vote for. They have mandates from their branches and from their provinces, which suggest that Cyril Ramaphosa is just ahead of Nkosazana Dlamini Zuma, but at the end of the day, individual delegates can alter their choices depending on a range of factors, including some positive ones, the nature of the debate, how the debate pans out at the conference, but also some questionable ones around, are people being paid to vote a particular way, and is that going to distort the outcome? So I think it's very, very hard to say. At the moment, the way the votes have gone, it looks like Ramaphosa is ahead. But all sorts of things can happen in the next few days.
But then if we base it on your analysis about which various provinces have actually the strongest hold in terms of delegate numbers, I mean, Mpumalanga's support for the ANC growing by 60% in the past 5 years, and the Northwest growing by 130% versus the total 10% that Gauteng actually has. So if we base it on those numbers and we say that in economic terms, ceteris paribus, everything else remains the same, based on the numbers, Dlamini Zuma actually has a very strong fighting chance.
It does look that way, that on pure short-term interests, it looks like the Nkosazana Dlamini Zuma camp is favored on the basis of the regional distribution of votes. But what is very hopeful about this is that I think there are a number of ANC members and branches that see the longer term, see the bigger perspective, that recognize that it's not just about government policy and redistribution. It's also, one has to take into account the generation of resources and the economic interests, a broader perspective of the interests of the country as a whole, not just the interests of particular parts of the country. So that's quite hopeful that there are grounds for optimism in thinking that the ANC, at least some parts of the ANC, still retain a broader perspective that's not purely a selfish one about our own narrow agendas.
And Prof, some might argue that private sector itself has been selfish in addressing its own interests, and this is why you've got the economic areas booming so forth, or doing a lot better than what we're seeing in the more urban areas. So what's the role of private sector here to also, in moving forward, ensuring that as the economy grows, that it grows more inclusively, such that those in the urban areas are also a lot more uplifted?
Yes, it's a very important point you make, that this is not just a criticism of the way the ANC's interests and agendas have drifted. It's also a reflection of the private sector not appealing and not doing enough for the majority of the population, not investing surplus resources available within the country, investing abroad, repatriating profits, an investment strike some people talk about. So it's critically important that the private sector also takes a broader interest in the long-term sustainability of the country. And that requires a vision that includes job creation as part of the objectives of business, that includes working in partnership with government and with communities to deliver the agenda of society, and not simply to make profits, although that is at the heart of the private sector. It has to take a broader and a longer term view, I think, rather than short-term profit maximization. That's, I think, what these membership trends suggest, that we've got a growing divide between our economy and our politics, and so it requires interests on both sides of the fence to really work harder at recognizing the interests of society as a whole.